So if you're used to programming in ActionScript 3, one of the biggest challenges for you moving to JavaScript is going to be the way in which you do object-oriented programming. Because like I mentioned in the last movie, we don't have things like classes. Everything is prototype-based and is based on functions. So in this movie, I'm going to basically show you how you would approach doing object-oriented programming in JavaScript. In Sublime Text, I've just created a blank document, and I'm just going to save this to the desktop as demo.html. And then using that snippet that we installed, I'm just going to type HTML5 and hit tab. And this basically gives me this boilerplate code. And we have an onload event which calls the init function, in which we can start doing things once the page is actually fully loaded. So what I'm going to do is create essentially a class, and I'm going to say class for this just because that's what we're used to calling things, but I'm going to create a new class called person. In JavaScript, we're going to actually be creating a function. I'm going to call it person. To the constructor, again, I'm calling it the constructor, but when we actually create a person object, we're going to send in two parameters. We're going to send in name and address. So now inside of this object, if I want to create some instance variables, I'm going to use the this keyword. So if I want to create an instance variable called name, I'm going to say this.name is equal to name. And that's the argument that we actually sent in. This is fairly similar to ActionScript, but if we're creating an instance variable, we have to use the this keyword. It's actually required. And I'm going to do the same thing for address. So I'm going to create an instance variable called address and set it equal to that argument that we sent in. Now let's say I wanted to create a method for this object. So we're going to create a really simple method called sayHello, which is essentially just going to spit out a string to the console. So I'm going to define a function in here, again using the this keyword. So this.sayHello is equal to function. And inside of this function, again, in ActionScript, we might do something like use a trace command to log something out. Well, we're just going to spit it out to the console. In WebKit browsers, we can spit out a piece of text for debugging purposes to the console. So I'm going to say console.log. And then we're essentially going to use this instance variable. We're going to say name. And then we're going to concatenate onto the end of that says hello. Now that I've created this method, we now have our simple class created. So if I want to create a new person object, I can do that. So I'm going to come down to my init function, which gets called as soon as my HTML page has finished loading. And I'm going to create a new instance of that person class. So I'm going to say var lee is equal to new person. And now I need to send in those two arguments. So I'm going to send in my name here, Lee Brimlow. And let me just put in a fake address here, 48 Smith Street. And that line of code, again, will use this function here to create a person object for me. So now if I want to call the sayHello method, I can just say lee.sayHello, like that. So if I go over to Chrome now and refresh, to get to the actual console, we want to right-click in here and go to Inspect Element. This is going to open the developer tools here inside of WebKit. And if I go to the console, we can now see that that text has actually been printed out. Lee Brimlow says hello. So I've created a new person object, and I was actually able to call that instance method. Let's take a look at actually the object itself. So under here, I'm actually going to send to the console, console.log, and pass in that Lee object that I created. And this will allow us to actually see what is inside of that object. So now we can see we have our person object. If I drill down into that, we can see we have a property called address with that string that I sent in. We have a property called name, and we have a function called sayHello. So again, we now have what is essentially a class that we've built using a function here. So when we're creating a class, we don't actually have to define everything right here in the constructor function. So let's say we wanted to define this say hello method outside of here. Well, I'm just going to copy this and get it outside of the constructor. Now to create a new method for the person class, I'm just going to assign it to the prototype property. So I can say person.prototype and then paste this in. Person.prototype.sayHello is equal to function. And this is creating a new method and assigning it to that person class. If I save this and go over to the browser and refresh, you'll notice that the name is not showing up here. And the reason for that is when it was inside of the constructor, we were referencing the argument itself, not the instance variable. So if I change this now to say this.name, and then go back to the browser, we can now see that the name shows up again. This is now an instance variable of that object. So if we want to reference it, we need to say this. So now another thing you might want to do when it comes to building a class is to provide some static properties. The way in which we do static properties is just to assign it to the class itself. So we can say person dot, we'll create a property called species is equal to human. So now this is not assigned specifically to all the instances. This is on the class itself. To reference that, I can just use this person.species anywhere throughout my code to reference that. This is great. You know, I can put in my classes and stuff right here in this script block. But generally speaking, if you're doing object-oriented programming, you're going to want to keep your classes in separate files so that you can just have a more robust structure for your application. So in the next movie, I'm going to show you how to take this class and actually build it out into its own separate file that you can include into this document.